the idea is not really a socially, mutually agreed, socially good behavior. It's a controversial idea. We think the OG already ruled out those ideas that are controversial, because for the government to argue and actually incept these socially controversial idea is very, very bad. We think the OG preemptively did that. Not really engaged by the opening opposition, right? But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, we think those behaviors like slavery happened not because people innately believed that was good, but because people simply chose to turn a blind eye against those behaviors, Mr. Speaker. And we think this is where our policy comes in. You don't need to learn what is bad if you can preempt that behavior to begin with, Mr. Speaker. With that, we go with preemptive justice, not retributive justice, because the consequences don't evaporate, Mr. Speaker, even if you serve time in jail, even if you pay what amount of money, Mr. Speaker. That's why it's very, very important. But second, deadlock the idea of self-interest, right? We think government is not effective in tackling this problem, but more importantly, social conditions, right? I'm going to tell you in my extension why we provide better social condition for these breeders of crime, Mr. Speaker. Number one, extension. Why trial and error is not affordable, Mr. Speaker, to begin with. 3 things. Number one, Mr. Speaker, we say that publicly, always when you leave it up to the free market of ideas, of which ideas are good and bad, ultimately the minority ideas are always going to be defranchised by the mainstream. So even if you believe that, it shouldn't be that, equality is not achieved, you can literally go out and rob these people because society tells them to do. No, thank you. The idea of free market doesn't really work, Mr. Speaker. But second idea regarding the idea of bigots, right? These people will commit those actions at any consequence, Mr. Speaker. Even if it's serving time in jail, even if it's capital punishment, those people are inherently actually not responsive to external regulations that we put up on them, Mr. Speaker. That's why we have to censor the mind. That's why we have to internally regulate them, Mr. Speaker, because bigots will listen to external regulation, Mr. Speaker. But third and most of all, Mr. Speaker, on the idea of self-justification, Mr. Speaker, we think the idea of certain people, when they decide to commit a socially bad behavior, they first judge and calculate whether that behavior is affordable in terms of their own morality, right? Can I commit or can I afford to commit this behavior and feel still good about myself? Mr. Speaker, we think people ultimately fall victim to self-justification. Like what the OGs, OO said, right? I'm poor, therefore society is driving me to this behavior. Therefore, I'm not the bad person. Society is the bad person, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, those behaviors are never eradicated on the Yo model, Mr. Speaker. That's why internal regulation is critical, not external regulation. Closing.
Madam, socially consensus or not, because these bigots, because these evil exist, isn't it true that the counterbalance, the betterments, continual development of the exists?
Prove to me why free market is so perfect when all these mainstream are already franchising minority ideas. But two, Mr. Speaker, we think the idea of preemptive justice still stands. You don't need to leave it up to the free market if you can prevent it from the beginning, Mr. Speaker. Second extension, sit down. Second extension, who achieves better sustainable social security and social welfare? Mr. Speaker, we say that government and status quo is not simply active enough in terms of legislating civic duty. What exactly do I mean by civic duty? Things like mandatory tax, things like mandatory military service to create, the public good of social revenue, the public good of national defense, Mr. Speaker. The reason why government is not doing enough, Mr. Speaker, is number one, they lie on the assumption that, social contract theory where your freedom to your ideas may be jeopardized, but in trade-off, Mr. Speaker, you get the protection that now is guaranteed, Mr. Speaker. But we don't think this idea of provision of public good is solely the government burden. Citizens also have to be part of that provision of social good. For example, things like not stealing stuff, things like not killing people, Mr. Speaker. We think it's extremely wrong for these guys to say, it's your job to do so. Therefore, citizens are entitled to whatever they want to think, even if those ideas are very, very violent. We think citizens also have to participate in terms of providing social justice, Mr. Speaker. That's why citizens need to be and must be internally regulated, Mr. Speaker. We say, on the closing government, that your external regulations failed and your free market ideas have already failed, Mr. Speaker. Given that's the situation, the only option that we have is the censorship of mind, internal regulation of preemption of these bad behaviors. For those reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
I thank the member of government. Let's invite member of opposition.
아 예쁘다.
Mr.
Mr. Speaker, as a person who suffered through emotional breakdowns and mental breakdowns and asking the questions of what is life in the past 3 months of my last year in college, it's an honor to be debating on emotion that is so central to what humans are and ultimately which direction our society needs to go through. Because the world that they depict to us is pretty much, number one, a very emotionless world where people are idealized to enjoy happiness because there's an absence of struggle. But secondly, and more importantly, they don't value the beauty in people trying to find out what is good in life. Because ultimately they think absence of evil leads to good. We think that coexistence of the two values and human beings ultimately choosing good behavior is the beauty of humanity and beauty of society. And that is the society that we want to promote for the closing opposition. So the unique contribution coming from the closing opposition is simple. We're going to prove to you that self-interest is ultimately the motivation of betterment of society and human beings as a whole. Because we think self-interest is an intrinsic value of human beings that allows us to be better and allows us to be, nice. Sit down. So responses to Helen's speech first. She tells us two things, right? That trial and error cannot be affordable because of these free market ideas and whatnot. First of all, she never told us what this social consensus behavior is to begin with. Because Taeyeong already told us in his speech that, look, back in the day, slavery was a socially consented good behavior to do. And through progress and through the free market of ideas that they seem to not like, is ultimately the progress that humanity has made. We tell you that that's because social values change, that's ultimately the direction we want to go through. But furthermore, she tells us, look, people are inherently not responsive. They're sometimes bigots. Problem is, your bench is going to incept everybody, eliminating self-interest in everybody. Not the psychopaths who can't sympathize with everybody, but every individual who's capable and willing to make their own choice based on their own free will is not going to have that anymore. And that's the problem you need to face. Furthermore, she tells us that a better society will be created because now protection is guaranteed, and now we need to internally regulate citizens' ideas. Mr. Speaker, this is terrifying vocabulary coming from the closing government, that we need to regulate people's ideas because we want a perfect world where everybody is not harmed. We tell you, yes, humanity has done huge atrocities in the past, but nonetheless, we value the idea of free will because that free will also entails that you will also make the better choice, that you will also create peace, not war. We tell you that ultimately you're manipulating people's ideas to create an ideal world simply doesn't work when you completely deny the importance and value of self-realization, self-determination, and ultimately free will. But yes, sir.
Sorry, you kind of have to engage with her, right? We agree that on the macro level it's going to be very good. But when I see my daughter die, right, that is pathetic. Where is the beauty of humanity there?
Mr. Speaker, the fact is, they're playing on a tricky line here, right? Because number one, they tell us self-interest is the problem, the root of all evil, because somehow self-interest is a bad philosophy or bad idea that people have. And then secondly, they tell us, look, nobody deserves to suffer, nobody deserves to feel pain. But the fact is, if you eliminate self-interest, you don't automatically get sympathy. They seem to tell us that you eliminate self-interest, sympathy remains, everybody will be acting as good citizens. Mr. Speaker, the idea of sympathy or the ability of relating to another individual only comes when you are able to relate to your own interests, your own needs to be protected as an individual, and your own survival kicks in for you to preserve yourself. That's when you can see the other person and realize, wow, this person's also human. This person must also feel what I need and what I want. And by eliminating self-interest, you don't prevent rape, you don't prevent crime, or you don't prevent any socially consenting crime, whatever that is, in the society. Because self-will, as dangerous it is, has greater value and greater advantage ahead. And that's where we're going to move on to extension. Right, so self-interest. Mr. Speaker, we think self-interest, no thank you, is ultimately self-preservation, survival instincts that they think of. Ultimately, we think self-interest is important to society and humanity. It's something that we cannot eliminate through exception on 3 levels. First of all, because it's a motivation to self-realize. Secondly, because it identifies who you are and where you are in the society. And thirdly, because it's the very reason and motivation behind ideas, choices, and actions, right? First of all, motivation to self-realize. Mr. Speaker, because we're all innately selfish, as the opening government, as well as the government bench proclaims, that is the reason we try to better ourselves. That is the reason we aspire for bigger dreams. That's the reason that we want to become better citizens of society. We tell you that self-interest innately is about taking care of yourself, is about being presentable to the opposite, party, and is ultimately the motivation to become better. But secondly, we think that self-interest is inherent in identifying who you are, what you need, and what you're capable of, right? Like, who am I in this world and what am I doing? We think this is an intrinsic question of humanity because that's what drives us into thinking about where the society needs to go and what kind of role we need to play in our society. We agree. Some people simply reach the conclusion that, look, I'm just going to thieve everybody and just, die because I feel no importance in my life. But we think majority of the society and how we've progressed as human beings in the past thousands of years is that we actually want to see a betterment of the world because we want to play a role in the society that is meaningful and that is special. We may not become superheroes, we may not become teachers that educate the younger generation, but nonetheless, we see that self-value, that self-esteem comes from self-interest and wanting to exist in the society with an absolute existence. No, thank you. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, we think that self-interest is the reason behind ideas, right? Like where we belong in the society, where should we go? Ideas are what essentially turns into choices, right? When there's a choice for me to be good, and when there's a choice for me to be bad, we tell you that calculus that you take in considering the consequences, in considering the motivations, and for you to choose good out of self-interest or whatever motivation is what makes good behavior a good behavior. Absence of evil does not mean all of a sudden good will prevail. It's the comparison of the two and the determination that you make as an individual that determines what good behavior is and what a good society is. Right? Furthermore, we tell you that these choices ultimately lead to actions. Now, we tell you that when we're talking about things that contributed to history of humanity, when contributed to society, we want to think about things like literature, things like art, things like culture, things like values and ideas and principles. We think ultimately this was achieved not because there was an absence of evil, not because people were selfless, but because people were selfish, because people wanted to identify themselves, because people wanted to play a role in this society, they decided to express themselves. They decided to take action. They decided that, look, this is what marks my world. This is what marks my existence in this society in my lifetime. And that's the motivation of how we have progressed as a society. That's why we don't treat women differently from men. That's why we don't treat different races differently. Because ultimately we identify in this world through self-interest. And an elimination of that is not going to guarantee anything and was not proven by all three speakers. So ultimately, at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, I think I could keep my promise to my juniors that I'm buying meat today, because it's absolutely KU2 that's winning this championship.
Thank you, Member of Opposition. Let's close government debate by inviting Government Whip.
Mr. Speaker, things like free market of ideas competing, things like trust in individual free will, things like the beauty of humanity all sound really nice and fluffy and good, right? But we think that in any debate, it's not about debating about ideals and optimistic values that are never going to change society. We think this debate has to be pragmatic, as any kind of policy debate has to be. So I'm going to be very, very clear in this debate, and first telling you what the justification for doing this is, and secondly telling you why it's more beneficial under our side of the house. Now, we think that the burden shifting from the opposition side was very, sneaky, but it failed because it's not our burden in today's debate to actually justify things like LGBT rights, justify things like gender equality, gender inequality, or justify things like slavery, right? Because we think that those things are controversial things. Those things are things that we know are not right, and we think that we can never argue for slavery in any kind of debate. So we think that it's a very, very wrong allocation of burden on the opposition side, right?
Maybe.
But I'm going to move directly into my first argument in telling you why this policy is actually just justified and legitimized. We think that when you consider society, the society is made up of a social contract, right? We think that the whole idea behind social contract is trading of rights and freedom. instead of like getting security, you limit your own freedom to a certain extent. For example, I'm not able to like suddenly hit Taeyeong on the head because that gives third party harm to him. Although I have the freedom to do whatever I want to do, right? We think that that kind of idea is the whole foundation of society. And this kind of provision of social norms is already being implemented in our society. For example, things like taxation. For example, things like military service in the case of Korea. For example, things like jury duties in the case of the United States. We think this policy is a simple extension of those kind of things being already carried out in our society. We think that the reason why status quo isn't enough through laws or education or campaigns, etc., those kind of policies being carried out, those kind of polices or prisons existing, is that because bigots always exist under the society. We think that there are always bad apples in any kind of society. For example, people that do things that they do, like killing or stealing just because they want to do it, those kind of immoral people sit down, or the kind of cases where people have to choose between their own personal rights and things that they know are right, where people are faced in this kind of moral dilemma. For example, when people are faced with choosing between their own profit and whether to go for like bribery, whether this is legally right or wrong, we think the problem is people always prioritize their self-interest, and they're always making these kind of wrong decisions in the kind of phases of those kind of moral dilemmas. That's where like the government's whole case comes in, because we think that there are simply things that are not being regulated, that are not being stopped under the status quo model of the kind of ideas coming from opposition, where they think that the free market of ideas competing will always like choose like that good idea at the end of the day and be able to save everyone in the society. We think that, like Taeyeong told you, that emotions are what make you human. But we think that emotions are what make you immoral. Emotions are what make you do those kind of inhumane actions of killing people, of raping people, of stealing other people's things, because you always prioritize your own self-interest. We think that because of this kind of whole problem, the society has to suffer a lot of losses. For example, crimes like murder, robbery, raping, those people dying because of these kind of things. But also, we think that resource of those kind of allocations simply cannot take place under their model, because those kind of money or resource are being used to like take care of those kind of bigots or unnecessary things, instead of being used in a kind of real way the society should function in keeping the progression and keeping the kind of stability within the society. But before I move on, yes.
If you support the idea that every disposition is innate, do you support killing these so-called bigots?
No, we don't want to kill these these bigots. The kind of idea that came from closing government was simple. We think that there are some things in society that have no contradiction, that are simply wrong in itself. For example, causing clear third-party harm to another individual. That's why we gave you ideas like killing. That's why we gave you ideas like raping. We want to make sure that people don't do other things. We think that under our model, killing of those kind of bigots are never going to happen. We think that under your model, killing of bigots does happen, because now what happens is if I'm a person, sit down, if I'm a person that really hates LGBTs, if I'm a person that really hates black people, although I know that the law legislates me not to do those kind of actions, although I know that if I carry on those kind of actions, I will be held liable, in the last minute of making my moral dilemma and making my moral decision, I always prioritize my own interest. I always prioritize my own morals, contrary to the kind of things that exist and are actually existing in the kind of social norm or so in that society. So moving on into my second extension, sit down. We think that I'm going to talk about the kind of harms and benefits that's going to come from our policy, because we think that every policy debate is about talking about and weighing those kind of harms and benefits coming from that exact policy. The kind of things that opposition talked about was social progression, and these kind of people are going to hurt the minorities who can never speak up, or these kind of things like slavery is going to happen. But we tell you that under our model, the best thing that happens is we are the one going for social stability. We think that already, like I told you, because of this kind of a lot of losses happening in the status quo, like simply this kind of allocation of money cannot be used in the way that they have to be used, and they must be used as, for example, going for more preemptive justice. Sit down. Preemptive justice rather than retributive justice. We think that under our model, we can prevent those kind of cases in going more for preemptive justice, because
under our model, people are not going to be committing those kind of crimes from the very beginning. People are not going to be doing those kind of immoral actions from the very beginning. We think that also what's going to help under our model is the kind of people that are actually overlooked in society right now, the kind of minorities, the kind of weaks, and the kind of people that are not functioning very well, like the poor people or morally wrong people, are the ones that we can actually take care of under our model. We think that we can actually pool all the kind of resources that now does not have to be wasted under our model and use them to actually, help those kind of people that are suffering under the status quo. Yeah. We think that that is a very, very equal and efficient allocation of resources. We think that the kind of idea of progression is also possible under our model, because we think that the idea of philosophy, we think that the ideas of different things, like ideas building upon each other is possible on any kind of case scenario, even under our model. We think that if like individuals can actually persuade other people that their idea and their moral and their idea of social norm or social good behavior is right, that kind of changes to the legislation, or that kind of changes the standard of what is right, can always take place. But we think that even if taking the proposal and taking the kind of assumption from the opposition side, even if we have to choose from progressive, even if we social progression can never take place under our model, we actually take social stability, we take that kind of social regulation and social stability, social goods being done under our model, and we're the one taking this debate home. We're very happy to propose.
Thank you very much, Government Whip. Let's close this debate by inviting Opposition Whip.
Now, yet again, EDiS comes up to the podium and dumbs down the debate and tell us that the debate is about the calculus between benefit and harms. We think, yes, ultimately, if you really simplify everything, it is calculus between harms and benefits. Nonetheless, we believe, Mr. Speaker, to analyze the issue of human nature and the goodness of free will, you really have to delve into the reasons and the, in a way, characteristics of what self-interest is, and why that's related so poorly to human nature. Hence, you can't simply remove it to achieve goodness. Okay, so let's divide the debate into two parts. Number one, clash nature of self-interest. Number two, clash value of free will in a government where you value free will. Okay, so let's move directly into number one, clash. We think that the debate from the opening half has been heavily about the cases of where self-interest served good, cases of where self-interest served badly. Now, my first wonderful speaker explained to you clearly how powerful a tool self-interest is when it comes to actions and intentions. But moreover, even when self-interest does resort to unfortunate cases of where it did end up hurting other people, we told you that we are willing to defend these cases, even if in that where humanity served or showed self-interest in its most evil form. Sit down. We tell you that self-interest is ultimately understanding the human nature and yourself. We tell you that it's led, ultimately, and a lot of the times to other values, because self-interest comes from the will to survive, because self-interest comes from the will to understand yourself and understand emotions that you have. We tell you that it's oftentimes led to, incentives to follow the law because you don't want to go to jail. Follow the loyalty to your country because that ultimately serves your self-interest. We tell you by erasing self-interest from the map, you're also dismissing the benefits that self-interest brings. We tell you they have the entire government bench has failed to take the burden of defending that case even. Sit down. And mind you, Mr. Speaker, the number one, we tell you that absolute anarchy of mind doesn't really mean you have goodness in heart. They told you that they're going to erase self-interest. We told you that's a strong motive for you to do a lot of the things. For example, to mark yourself in the history, to do good things, to behave well so that you receive recognition, to do, create wonderful art and literature. Sit down. But nonetheless, even if you erase these motives, doesn't mean you feel that the human nature fills it up with the perfect empathy and sympathy. Why? Because we've explained to you that sympathy comes from understanding yourself. Therefore, you find that this person would go through the same level of emotional distress even if you act in that way. We tell you, hence, your absolute anarchy of mind does not serve any interest of the humanity, does not serve any goodness of humanity at the end of the day. Secondly, CG comes up to the podium and talks to us why emotions lead to immorality. We tell you Youngcho is completely wrong. Why? Because number one, CG dismissed the goodness of the emotions, such as empathy, such as sympathy, such as love, which leads to goodness. But secondly, more importantly, we tell you they have to, in a way, we've explained to you, Mr. Speaker, that even the existence of evil, even the immorality leads to goodness, leads to continual development. Mr. Speaker, as mindful as we are about how Nazis are bad, if imperialism never existed, we tell you the development of the idea of UN as a whole community to serve humanitarian intentions wouldn't have developed in that sense. We tell you evil, because it exists, it calls upon the development or the rise of the good as in checks and balance. We tell you that counterbalance is never going to happen if you completely deny the existence of evil as a whole. Hence, even in the worst case scenario, we tell you our case is in a way even stronger. Sit down. Closing, do you have any PYs?
Man, we think that first of all, self-actualization can also happen under our model, but we think that killing people and stealing things has nothing to do with your identity or motivation to become a better person.
Okay, we tell you because the bigots, like you say, because these stealers, these murderers exist, the society is more mindful to appreciate the value of good. Society is more mindful of creating a society, a system that values these goodness, that checks, that teaches people that you have to choose the goodness. We tell you, Mr. Speaker, goodness is the process of choosing. When you have two choices of killing another person and do not kill another person, goodness comes from making that choice, making the mindful choice of the willful choice of not choosing to kill the person. We tell you when you take away that choice, number one, you also undermine as a whole of the humanity or the citizens who would have chosen the good choice. You undermine these people because you no longer suggest that choice. But number two, even so, the existence of calling upon more goodness doesn't exist, therefore the continual development doesn't happen. Let's move on to my second clash, value of free will and government. Mr. Speaker, we think government only exists, the liberal democracy only exists under the premise that there's a contention that people and individuals are sovereign, that they're reasonable and good. When you completely deny that premise to begin with, government can no longer exist. Now the entire government bench tells us that people are too dumb, people are too evil to choose goodness. Hence, let us teach them, let us internally regulate them so that okay, hell with progression, we'll just choose stability. We tell you that doesn't really stand because the setting, the context of debate is where the government willingly give these people the benefit of the doubt, where they will end up choosing the goodness. Hence, sorry for you, right? Moreover, they told us that the idea of consensus, right? That was the unique contribution coming from the closing government, where there's a social consensus of what's good and bad. Therefore, we can choose. Government has the power to choose that social consensus and enforce that upon people. We tell you, Mr. Speaker, now we have social consensus that slavery is horrible. Back then, we didn't have that consensus. The reason why we had civil war was because it was a controversy, right? That means, as as a matter of fact, there was no consensus to begin with. If you're willing to leave it up to the public to decide what's good or bad, we tell you your future is grim and dim, right? Secondly, more importantly, how are you going to ever hold minorities more strongly? How are you ever going to empower the minority when you leave everything up to public discussion where a majority is bound to always prevail? Entire minority discussion wouldn't happen even under your model because you're always leaving it up to the consensus of the people, which is the majority, which majority has the advantage over. Lastly, about the stability. Mr. Speaker, we're willing to let go of the stability when that stability is built upon discrimination, when that stability is built upon hating other people, when that stability is built upon unwilling choice of the people, like the robots, right? We tell you, we value humanity. The beauty of the humanity is that you go through these mental breakdowns, you go through these mental distresses, and yet at the end of the day, at the end of a horrible day, you willingly choose to do a good action. That action doesn't exist under their model. We're extremely happy to propose.
That concludes the last speech at NEAO 2012. Thank you all the finalists. And please, another round of applause for finalists.